Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, historian and author Kathy Peiss on the librarians who saved books in World War II.
Initially, their concern was with rare manuscripts and rare books. And over time, it became apparent that the threat to knowledge in its printed form was far greater than simply the rare and unique items. So yes, it's almost as though there were two tracks. They brought on Germans who they believed, who were sort of cleared of Nazi collaboration, to go through these boxes of materials and decide, is this Nazi, is this militaristic? Should this be destroyed? Should this be kept? And McLeish, being a very inventive, creative guy, imagined that an intelligence service could kind of be built on the model of a large library.
Kathy Peiss, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's nice to chat with you again. We had a brief chat not long ago about some common interest issues involving intelligence history. But I first became aware of your work because of the overlap between the issues we're really going to focus on today, which is librarians, information science affecting national security, and the other way around, how national security influenced information science. But I can't have a conversation with you and not take advantage because you wrote the book on the Zoot Suit, right?
Yes.
This is amazing. So somebody who has the ability to talk about intelligence history and the history of libraries and their interaction with national security, but also the definitive expert on the Zoot Suit. I mean, this is remarkable. How did you find yourself getting into a field, I think cultural history, you call it. How did you find yourself getting into a field that allows you to basically research anything you want?
Well, I was very fortunate as a graduate student to do a field which is called American Studies, and it's very wide-ranging. I was not narrowly cast in a historian's mode, and it gave me a feeling of freedom, really, to pursue whatever interested me. And when I started out as a historian or as a scholar, I was interested in the history of women. It was a new field at the time. But I never felt like I needed to be pigeonholed and, in fact, like the variety of work. And so the Zoot Suit book actually came out of a course that I taught when I was at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And we had a course that was based entirely on primary documents. And I chose the Zoot Suit because there was a riot attached to, involving the Zoot Suit. And it was this really interesting question of can a fashion cause a riot? And one thing led to the next, and I wound up writing the book on the Zoot Suit.
I think people of a certain generation are familiar with that history only because in the 1990s, with the slight Zoot Suit revival, it wasn't major, but it was slight. But there was a top 40 song called Zoot Suit Riot. And
that's right.
most people, I'm guessing 99%, listened to the song, danced to it, didn't care. But 1% did actually look up what Zoot Suit Riot. Is that just a weird phrase they came up with? No, it wasn't. It was 1942 or 1943. There was a no kidding riot. And there were any Zoot Suits banned during the war, or were they just discouraged because of I remember the reading once that there was an issue of Zoot Suits during the war became unpopular with the government because they used so much cloth and there was rationing. And there were efforts to actually crack down on Zoot Suits for that and perhaps cultural reasons as well.
Yes, that's exactly right. There were these efforts to conserve textiles, and so there were guidelines for women's clothing and men's clothing. But the Zoot Suit, because it was an extreme fashion, using up so much fabric, and because it was considered a bit sketchy, it was worn by African-American youth, Hispanic youth. It was actually banned to be manufactured. It wasn't banned to be worn. So that was the distinction, but it had a kind of negative connotation attached to it by the government and a celebratory connotation by the young people who wore it.
So and I apologize, I have not read the Zoot Suit book, but I now have it on my list. but if you could give away a little bit of the plot there. So the Zoot Suit, as I recall, started with African Americans, and then slowly into the 30s and 40s, it became a more wide fashion trend, if you will. Did it ever break through beyond being seen as kind of an oddity? Was it commonplace enough that you would actually see Zoot Suits worn as typical fashion, or was it usually more in performances and things of that sort?
Well, it really arose in the 1930s, and like most fashions, it was an extension of a trend that was already going on, which is a sort of baggy sack suit. If you think of the films of the 30s and you think of somebody like Cary Grant wearing a kind of baggy suit, it took off in Harlem in particular, and there was a sense among young Black men, of a particular look that they wanted to convey. It was a kind of a dandified look, so it was very sharp, and it spread quite quickly. Once it began to take off among young people, it moved very quickly around the country, to Los Angeles, where the riot took place, worn by Mexican American young men known as pachucos. It was part of a youth subculture, and it even extended into white young men's culture. So Italian men, Jewish men of Jewish background, they were wearing this fashion as well. And so how extreme it was kind of measured. Some Zoot Suits were not really Zoot Suits, but were called Zoot Suits as a way of kind of affirming or decrying a particular style.
Yeah. I don't know why, it's just a side interest, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask you about it. As I recall, in reading your book, Information Hunters, which we're going to talk about a lot of the subject matter there today, I don't recall Zoot Suits coming up, and that's a shame, because I would love to see, William Donovan actually putting on a Zoot Suit once. Not his normal style, but that would be fun. Or, well, who was the Librarian of Congress?
Archibald MacLeish,
yes, that's
the famous poet and playwright who surprisingly became the Librarian of Congress during the war years.
Yeah, I picture these guys, and I don't really see them in Zoot Suits, but
no,
it would be nice. Yeah, so I've been interested for quite a time in issues of information organization and structuring. Maybe it comes from my intelligence background, where you really had to deal with massive amounts of information, and you had to have an ordering system, a way of keeping track of all the information. And even in any individual assessment or analysis you were doing, you had to have a way of systematizing your processing of the information, so that you could include it. And there's a whole science about that, right? The information science deals with that. Librarians are experts at not finding books on shelves, but actually understanding information and taxonomies and everything else. But what I didn't know is how explicit that link was in World War II. I did have some awareness, probably from the movie Monuments Men, that there was a link between some, architects and art historians and museum curators. But there was a much wider, much larger project that involved librarians and experts in information management that took us into World War II. So that's what we're going to talk about mostly here. But you had a unique entry point into this study. Do you want to tell the story of your uncle and how researching your uncle led you into this massive effort?
So one day, it was, I think in 2002, I was doing a Google search on my father, who had a tax case before some tax court, and I thought I could find it for him. And I used the Boolean operators to exclude myself. Early Google search before all of the, all of what we know now as Google. And up came a memorial to my father's oldest brother named David Priess. It was on the University of California website, and it discussed him. I knew he was a librarian, but I had no idea that he was in the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime civilian intelligence agency, and that he had played a role in acquiring publications and other materials, which today we'd call open source materials, for the war effort. And after the war, he headed a mission of the Library of Congress to acquire publications that had been printed in Germany and in German-occupied countries. And I just, I looked at the computer and I just sat back and thought, what? I've never heard anything about this. And so I did a little quick research on him, looked at he had a handful of publications. He had published a translation of a history of libraries. He translated from the German. And in one issue, one edition of this, there was a memorial to him, about 15 pages, written by various men that I later learned were leading lights in the library field. Well, naturally, I called my parents, who were still alive at the time, got my father on the phone, and he was, I really can't tell you anything about what Reuben was doing during the war. He was in the Pacific. He was a medic on Okinawa, all of that. And then I get my mother on the phone and she said, oh, yes, Reuben was a spy. As my family does not tell family stories, this all was new to me. And unfortunately, we had no letters, not even a photograph of him in our possession. But I wound up tracing the men who had written this memorial. I thought all of them were dead by this time. And they were all pretty important people. One was the head of the Harvard Library. One was the head of the New York Public Library. And one of them, whose name was Frederick Kilgore, was actually still alive. And I had an email address for him at the University of North Carolina. And so I sent him an email, and that night got a phone call from this 90-something-year-old man who was an innovator in the library field. He created the precursor to what is now known as WorldCat, the largest online catalog of library materials in the world. And he said, I'm so glad you called me. I worked with Reuben Priess at the Harvard Library, and then I recruited him into the OSS. And of course, one thing led to another. You're down one rabbit hole after another. I got to meet him, spent a nice afternoon with him. And initially, I thought I was just figuring out a family story. And then what I realized was that this was a much larger story. There were many librarians, scholars, collectors involved in the acquisition and protection, preservation, and recovery of books and other kinds of published materials in Europe during World War II. And that's what set me on the path to writing this book.
It was certainly a revelation to me as well, finding out about it from your work, because the research that I'd done, though very limited into the OSS, revealed that, of course, there were thousands of professors and researchers on everything from political science and economics to sociology and psychology who were brought into the OSS and became Donovan's professors. But that was for the Office of Research and Analysis. But even the stuff that I've read, I don't recall seeing anything about this effort with the librarians and the other information experts. So how fascinating for you, right, on both levels, as Dr. Peiss, you're studying this and realizing here's a whole new slice of history with impacts that far outlast the war that people haven't really dug into in depth because some of the people involved just didn't bother to tell their stories. And then as Kathy, you're finding out family history here and realizing, wait a minute, as I dig into the archives, there's a whole lot of stuff that Reuben did and wrote, and some things he was doing overseas that were remarkable, even if he wasn't my relative. What a fun journey that would be. But being your uncle, did you get a chance to know him? I know he died soon after the war, right?
Yes, he did. And he actually died the year before I was born.
Oh.
He died in 1952, and he was 40 years old. He was very sick he was a very frail person, or a weak person, through much of his life. He was classified 4F by the draft. And this was really for him an opportunity to serve the country and also being of Jewish background to be involved in a war effort against something that he, believed was an evil. And so I think for him, it was an amazing opportunity, but going to Portugal, then Germany in difficult conditions, he was very sickly through all of this, this time. And so died quite young.
Well, I want to build up to those stories in both of those places you mentioned. I think the Lisbon angle is fascinating. And then, of course, all of the work in Germany. But let's lay the foundation. So this wasn't the first time that librarians had gotten involved with essentially military and national security history. I mean, back even in the First World War, didn't the American Library Association create a war service? And what did they do?
Yes, they did. The American Library Association was very committed to serving the nation. And during World War I, they didn't send people overseas, but they did create library services that within public libraries throughout the country. They were interested in making sure that books got in the hands of people who would be fighting, men who would be fighting in the war, but also to inform the community about the war effort. And there was a strong internationalist orientation to the American Library Association. They were connected to librarians all over the world. There were these networks that existed in the 19th century and were very strong and important. And they wanted to maintain this sense of the significance of books and knowledge for peace building and for, creating a world in which there wouldn't be world wars. They were quite dedicated to that idea.
And there was one event in World War I that, frankly, I had forgotten about until your work rekindled my memory. And this was the university in Belgium that had been destroyed. I can't remember where it was.
Louvain, yeah. Leuven.
Tell that story about what happened in the First World War, and then the great effort and the huge publicity that was given to this effort. And of course, it doesn't end well in the Second World War, but describe that effort and how it really galvanized much of the book collecting community, librarians, philanthropists who cared about culture and knowledge. Walk through that story, if you will.
Yes. So during World War I, the German army, obviously it invaded Belgium and kind of laid siege to Leuven and intentionally burned the university library there. There was a famous, Catholic university. The collection was, over 1,000 years old. And it was burned, destroyed. And it became a symbol, one of the many symbols of German atrocity, for Americans and British, and the French.
And it wasn't intentional burning, right? This was not a kind of a casualty, side casualty of war. The Germans deliberately set fire.
That's right. Yeah. There's a librarian historian who's coined the term libricide, the intentional destruction of libraries as a way to destroy culture, to, maybe even part of a sort of genocidal intention of destruction. And you see it in many different places over time, including in Sarajevo, during that war in the 1990s. So yes, this was intentionally destroyed, and it became a symbol of why the Allies were fighting. And after the war, there was a massive effort to raise money to rebuild the library. It brought millions of people involved and give even small donations, and then many who gave quite large donations to rebuild the library and have it rededicated, which I believe was in 1928. I think that Herbert Hoover, who was very important in war relief during World War I, it took a significant role. He was involved in this too, and of course, he became a major collector of war materials during and after World War I. And so the library was rebuilt and then destroyed again during the Nazi blitz into Belgium in 1940.
Such a huge effort to rebuild it. And I think you noted that it was actually open in peacetime for fewer years than the rebuilding effort took before 1940 saw its destruction again. Well, with the Second World War, very quickly there came an effort when people realized on multiple fronts that there's a whole lot of cultural history that's worth preserving, and this could be the fine arts. This could be the book by Robert Edsel and Brett Whittier, which turned into the movie Monuments Men. But also on the library side, people realizing that there are not only rare documents, manuscripts that need to be preserved, but just the general knowledge, right? University libraries, even personal libraries. And so the United States has an effort from almost the beginning of U.S. entry into the war that came out of conversations between the emerging spy chief, Bill Donovan, and the Librarian of Congress. Talk through their conversations and how that set up the efforts that went on through the war.
Yeah, so William Donovan, the OSS head, or when it was begun, it was called the Coordinator of Information, and Archibald MacLeish. They're a bit of an odd couple, but they were deeply engaged with each other. I mean, both were interventionists. They wanted the U.S. involved in the war, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they both believed that information would be a crucial aspect for Americans in bringing them into the war and then in winning the war. And so Donovan got a kind of education from British intelligence about how to do an intelligence agency. And MacLeish, being a very inventive, creative guy, imagined that an intelligence service could kind of be built, at least the intelligence gathering could be built on the model of a large library. And that you could place people in around the world to, and their idea at this time, the collaboration between them was for open source intelligence. Newspapers, magazines, industrial manuals, all sorts of items printed on paper that could somehow be analyzed and then used. Donovan, of course, also had strong ideas about setting up special operations, sabotage units and the like, but that was not where this collaboration occurred. And they set up a committee of various representatives from the war agencies, the War Department, the State Department, Bureau of the Treasury Department, and others, to begin to think about how to acquire foreign publications. And so the committee, it was a committee called, so kind of unwieldy name, the Interdepartmental Committee for the Acquisition of Foreign Publications. I referred to it as IDC throughout the book because it's so long. And the committee was set somewhat apart from the OSS, but it was under the rubric of the OSS. Mm-hmm. And there had been various scholars who had gone around the world kind of seeing that the war was developing. Some had gone to China, some had gone to Europe. A representative of the Hoover Library had gone to Russia to acquire materials. And so the idea began to develop that you could send librarians, collectors, and other people who had a knowledge of languages and what might be valuable to outposts in neutral cities to acquire these materials. And that was the start of this effort.
I think that's fascinating. There's really two things going on that are in sync at that point. One is the preservation, the collection. We don't want these things to go away during the war. And parallel to that, though, was the national security mission, the idea that we can understand the conflict, we can understand the parties to it, we can protect national security better if we have this information to study. So it was both the collection side for its own sake, but there was a practical benefit, or so they thought, to getting these materials that would actually help analysts get insight into what was going on.
Yes, and I would say that it took a little time before the general acquisition of books was for preservation purposes was seen as useful. So there was a separate committee that the Monuments Men came out of, and that was established in 1943, and a number of art historians, curators, university people were involved in this, as Robert Edsel has told that story so well. And initially their concern was with rare manuscripts and rare books. And over time, it became apparent that the threat to knowledge in its printed form was far greater than simply the rare and unique items. So yes, it's almost as though there were two tracks, and they came together in the war period.
So this sets the stage for some Americans to go overseas with this kind of official backing, linked loosely to the OSS to do some work. And many people were involved, including this guy named Reuben, but there were some remarkable women involved, and I really want to hear their stories. One woman you talk about was born Maria Meyer, but became known as Miss Jose Meyer, and she had been working for the Library of Congress in cataloging before moving to Europe in the 1930s. Talk a little bit about what she did, and this was particularly early, right? This is not the end game of 1945, 46, but early in the war, what did she do?
Yeah, so I believe it's Jose Meyer, I think. And interestingly, I do not even have a photograph of her. I couldn't find one in the Library of Congress. But she worked for the Library of Congress in Paris. She was their European representative and was there to acquire books, to make contacts in the library world, and was really not set up to be a spy. But when the Germans marched into Paris in June of 1940, she kind of took the measure of this, and instead of just leaving, like many Americans intelligently did, she stayed put. She had run out of money. She needed her visa renewed. There was all sorts of reasons. And McLeish told her, collect everything you can for a war collection. And she began collecting all of this material. And at the same time, she began to go into the bookstores and libraries that the Nazis had taken over and had begun to purge of any, anti-fascist literature, Jewish literature, socialist or communist literature, all of that, which they had done in Germany. And so there were these lists of forbidden books that could not appear in the bookstores. And she, a gendarme, happens to have one of the lists. He gives it to her. She writes it out overnight, returns it to him. And she writes these reports that are essentially intelligence reports to the Library of Congress about what is actually going on. And she's the first person to inform American officials of what is going on the ground with respect to the cultural world. And these reports are sent by Archibald McLeish to Roosevelt, who's very interested in this. And she's there, she stays until December of 1940 and then needs to find a way to get out. She gets an exit visa for her furniture and personal collections. And at the last minute, she swaps the furniture for all of this war material. And it goes with her to Lisbon, and she comes back home from Lisbon.
That's a brilliant move. And it's one of those that's even more remarkable when you consider that there was no intelligence tradecraft. There were no standard operating procedures for things like this. She was just using her own wit and energy and putting herself in danger and finding a way to get it done.
Yeah, she's just amazing.
There's another woman that you tell the story of that I'd like to hear more about. And this is Adele Kyber, who is someone I really want to meet. When I build my time machine and I do that thing where you get together 4 people from history to sit and chat with, she's pretty high on my list now because she was absolutely amazing. Talk about her story. Yes,
Adele Kyber was a woman who grew up in California. She went to University of California, Berkeley for her undergraduate work. She was a classics scholar, went on for a PhD at the University of Chicago in the early 1930s in medieval linguistics. That's very unusual. And for women to be doing that kind of thing. And she of course, could not find an academic job, went to Europe and was copying manuscripts for professors at the University of Chicago. They paid her to do this, and she knew all of the libraries in Germany, France, Italy. She spent a lot of time in the Vatican and in Spain. And she began to learn how to take photographs using a Nikon camera of these manuscripts. In 1940, she returns back to the United States because, she leaves an account of this. She publishes an account of this, how, she's sort of one step ahead of the Germans as she's going from one library to another. And it finally becomes too hot for her to stay in Europe, and she comes back home. And she is then recruited into the IDC to microfilm publications and other materials in Stockholm, Sweden, one of the central neutral places for the conveyance of German publications and German
And let me
materials.
note here, if I understand the technology right, microfilming was not a widespread technology. She did not technically invent it, but she was very important in getting its widespread use, but actually getting it done in the field under trying circumstances.
Yes, microfilm was a fairly new technology, as you say, and it was beginning to take hold among people who were sort of the high-tech people of their day. And the idea was that you could make these rare materials available widely to scholars using microfilm. And in the case of the war effort, where you were trying to bring back to the US and to London newspapers, magazines, other kinds of material that weigh a lot, and there's no way to transport them, the microfilm reduces the weight to virtually nothing.
And this is interesting because her efforts then, as opposed to, books and large scrolls of Torahs and other things that are out there, we're really talking about press material with a lot of her effort in Stockholm. Is this part of those, what were they called, the press reading bureaus that the British and the US set up?
Yeah, so there were press reading bureaus set up usually through embassies, and the British were really the pioneers of this. And they had really interesting people all over the place, Stockholm, in Geneva, in Lisbon. And the idea was that these people would read the local press or subscribe to the German press through fake, they would get a local to get a subscription and would acquire the newspapers.
Sure.
They would read it, summarize it. And the summaries were often used for propaganda purposes, that there'd be something that could be turned to propaganda use. Oh, the morale is low in Germany. Oh, the corn crop is not going well, or something along those lines. Probably not corn, wheat. So the Americans really brought in the microfilm effort. It's kind of classic Americans liking the technology. And in Sweden, there was what was called the Anglo-American Microfilm Unit, which Adele Kyber was in charge of, in which the British acquired many of the publications. She did as well, but really there was a kind of joint effort there. And her team would be reproducing these on microfilm to be sent, one copy sent to London, one copy sent to Washington.
Did you get a sense in your research? There have been, I want to say, whole libraries filled with books on this topic of the rivalry between U.S. and British intelligence services, even as they're helping each other in various theaters of the war in almost every way. But on this particular issue, on the issue of acquiring publications, was it truly more of a joint effort in places like Stockholm, or did you pick up in your research that there actually were some tensions and some rivalries about how to do this?
I think that the British generally looked down on the Americans as amateurs, as not knowing very much, as not having experience in the intelligence world in the way they, of course, did. They truly did, being an empire. They had a lot of experience with intelligence long prior to World War II. I think there was good cooperation in Stockholm between Adele Kyber and her British counterparts. In fact, she saw them as more sophisticated and knowledgeable than she thought the people back in Washington were. And the people in Washington were, I think, uncomfortable with having a woman do this work and didn't know how to address her. They talked down to her at times, and she would just push back without any problem at all. And I think she got support from the British for doing that.
And probably, given that it was still an empire at the time, I would imagine that there was a more cooperative attitude towards things involving Germany and Europe than things involving India.
That's right. There was also one of these acquisitions. The IDC was located in New Delhi, for example, and there was a great deal of tension with the British authorities around acquiring newspapers by the Congress Party, for example. And they really did not want the Americans getting a hold of those.
Well, I've delayed long enough the true gem here, which is the story of Reuben Pice, especially in Lisbon. And it really opens up the door to talking about Lisbon during World War II. Fans of Casablanca got a glimpse of it when we talked with Meredith Hindley on this podcast about her research into World War II, Casablanca and Morocco. There was a hint of that. But Lisbon was a truly amazing place, even to the point of bookstores and, stores that carried magazines and newspapers becoming hotspots for literal spies, people trying to acquire information before other people did, or to move information through those methods. So talk a little bit about wartime Lisbon as it relates to this story of information flow, and then how Reuben plays in there.
Yeah, so Lisbon is, as you say, a hotspot of intelligence gathering and misinformation, propaganda on the one hand and intelligence gathering on the other. Before the Americans are there are many British agents and propagandists there trying to get out. There's an entire effort to spread rumors on the part of everybody. There's a German propaganda bookstore in Lisbon. I mean, basically the head of the head of the regime, Antonio Salazar, lets this go on as a neutral place as long as it is not undermining his authority. And he has his own spies and his own secret police. So there's a many layered world of spies, and there's a lot of, commentary about, you go to the casino and there's a German spy gambling next to a British spy and a Portuguese agent overlooking both of them at the roulette wheel. And so there's also, for the Americans who go in, there's a lot of difficulty figuring out how to navigate this world because it is so murky. They can't get a fix on it. Sending the Americans librarians to collect and to microfilm material is actually seen by the OSS head there, the chief of the Lisbon office, to be a kind of, it's almost as though the print gives you a more secure sense of what is real. And so they are there microfilming day and night, beginning around 1943. Reuben Piess is there, as well as a colleague from the New York Public Library named Ralph Carruthers. And the two of them, I mean, like everybody who's in Lisbon, they seem to pick up the habits of spies, listening in on conversations, reporting gossip. Ralph Carruthers gets himself into some trouble reporting gossip and is told, you can't go into Spain. It's too dangerous for somebody with loose lips. So they wend their way into this spy operations. They're helpful to the other parts of the OSS who are in Lisbon, who are doing other kinds of more secretive work. Reuben Piess goes to the OSS on a regular American passport. He's identified as a representative of the Library of Congress, who is just collecting material, nothing more than that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's great that some of the tensions about, how far does an operator in the field go are coming up even in this context, right? Because you have Spain is a different place than Portugal. It's a little more dangerous. There's, certainly more of a German presence there. And you could have somebody with the skills and the access but the bosses see it as a risk that, no, the stuff you're doing is valuable enough. Don't try to do that extra stuff and get yourself in trouble. And yet, story after story, you found that because some of these boundaries were not well defined, because people did not have explicit orders, sometimes they were told just go and get interesting stuff, that people were exceeding their brief rather frequently.
Yes, and one of the things that was, I think, important in Lisbon was that there were Allied sympathizers among people in the book trade. And there was one bookstore in particular where the owners went into Spain to acquire materials for the OSS and for a true representative of the Library of Congress. So they found ways to get materials that otherwise would have been, if the guardrails had been sharper, they wouldn't have been able to go in. But they were able to make those trips and to get materials.
And I think we might want to be a little more explicit about the value of these materials. So at this point, you could be thinking, well, so what? They're popping around a neutral city that's a lot more comfortable than being in the war zone, and they're just grabbing some books and magazines. Why is that important? But I think when you take things like technical manuals or industrial handbooks that are floating around, and even scientific periodicals, there could be evidence there of enemy troop strength, and what parts of the economy are being shifted to this or that. But even the gossip, right? Even the newspapers with gossip columns or society pages can provide information about the location of troops or about scandals that could be exploited for propaganda purposes. So it sounds like it's kind of not very dangerous and not very useful, but I think there were elements of both in there.
Yeah, I think there was some element of danger. They could certainly have been arrested, and probably shipped back to the United States. I mean, that would have been the worst of it. The utility of the material, I think that's very hard to assess. And, the Frederick Kilgore, who ran the operation from Washington and had to put in budget requests every year to Congress, made the case that, these were incredibly useful. The scientific discoveries after the war, he, in fact, said there was information related to German lack of progress on the atomic bomb. I don't know if that's really true. What I do know is that the analysts in Washington, who, as you said, were often scholars of these countries, and who were themselves kind of good at detection, were able to read the newspapers carefully with the idea of teasing out important information, of a background, of a kind of that would be useful maybe strategically, not operationally
right.
at all. I mean, that was really more the military intelligence. So, for example, they would read the obituaries in German newspapers, and the obituaries would include German officers, but not ordinary soldiers, but they would be able to extrapolate, or they tried to extrapolate from those deaths how effective a particular bombing raid might have been, or some other kind of attack. That's the kind of thing they were trying to do.
Absolutely. There's so many good wartime stories here, both involving your uncle and the other people involved here from the war itself. And then we'll address the issue of the occupation of Germany and the preservation efforts there. But during the war itself, what was your favorite story that you uncovered about somebody doing that going that extra mile to acquire that book, or finding a way to get the book back to the United States?
Oh, there's so many that are really interesting. I'll take you into Paris. The war is still on, but Paris has been liberated, and the OSS sends an agent who's part of this collecting effort, whose name is Rossley Finney. Finney was a composer, a modernist composer who taught at Smith College, but wanted to do something for the war effort. And he went to Paris, and he's one of the few people where I was able to find personal letters to his wife, in this case, describing what he was doing. And maybe that's what makes it more powerful to me. Most of what I read were people's reports,
Right.
which
A
were
little dry.
formal.
Yeah.
And so at one point, he goes off on this drive through southern France, and there are still mines all over the place. He sets off a mine and is injured, but he's okay, as it turns out. But he has a driver, and he's sitting in the back, and his driver is regaling him with stories about his sexual conquests. And then Finney finds himself in these towns in southern France, meeting up with people who were leaders of the resistance, who are giving him resistance newspapers and other kinds of materials that document the extraordinary effort of those who fought in the underground. And it's that kind of thing where, that required a kind of courage and stepping out of any role one would have thought for oneself before the war. Here's a composer doing this. And that, I think, I found especially moving.
That's amazing. And like you said, there are many stories like that. That's not the only one. But it is a shame that there aren't more letters and more personal stories, that a lot of it was in these dry cables, right?
Yeah. Reports and the like. Ruben Peiss doesn't reveal very much about his personal life.
Yeah.
People always ask me, did he have a girlfriend? Did he have a boyfriend? Did he have,
You don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. So workmanlike. Well, let's turn to I don't want to say after the war, because some of it was happening as the war was ending, but the teams going in to Germany, and it became a massive effort. The expense of all of this, I don't know if you were ever able to find spreadsheets about the expenses, but so many people during the war, and then as this effort began after the war, it almost seemed like they were given blank checks saying, you get what you need to get. And I still don't have a sense of where the money came from to do this, because this must have been extraordinarily expensive.
Yeah. So as the war was ending in the latter part, 1945, and then even late 44 and after, these teams of documents gatherers known as T forces, target forces, were moving into every liberated area and then into Germany as Germany was being occupied by the Allies, and basically taking everything. Virtually everything. I mean, there were certain rules about, not taking materials from a university library, for example, but anything that might be useful in the immediate post-war and potentially in fighting the Japanese, which are still going on. That was the justification. These T forces, which were composed of, in most cases, army personnel, people who were in the armed forces already, and some of these OSS types who were librarians or collectors and the like.
Right.
And they would literally be following the troops and going into a city, going to the city archives, going to the local Nazi headquarters, going to wherever there might be, to the businesses where there might be patent records or other industrial records, and scooping all of these up. And so, yes, it was a vast effort. I haven't seen it broken down, the financial side of this broken down at all. My guess is it's pretty buried. It would be really hard to uncover.
Talk a little bit more about the T forces, because one of the images that comes out of the parallel effort, the Monuments Men movie, one of the images that comes out is the tension between the military commanders and these nerds going in looking for books and art. That is, why am I going to risk my soldiers' lives to get you in a place so that you can grab an old book? It seems like generally they worked well, but there certainly were some challenges, right?
Right. I mean, I think it was I think with respect to documents, that was an easier case to make to military authorities. You want to know who was in the Nazi party in this town, or who was running the town from Germany. You want all that information, or who was a sympathizer, a collaborator. That was important. It was more difficult to make the case that we should be taking these books because we don't have them, because they were printed in Germany, because they might tell us something. That's where you saw some, local commanders or, occupation authorities saying, I don't really see the value of that. And so it was all kind of wrapped up in the same effort. I would say that when Germany is being conquered by the Allies, and there are discoveries of large caches of books in caves, in mines, in castles, I think the authorities, the military authorities, realize we've got to do something about this and figure out what is going on here. And in many cases, those books were simply the Germans moving them to safe places to keep them away from bombing. And many of them, millions of them, were books that had been looted from libraries in occupied countries, from Jewish individuals, Jewish organizations, and they were this vast quantity of looted books that had to be dealt with. And that's where the Monuments Men intersect with this collecting effort, publication collecting effort.
It leads to at least two really thorny issues. One of them is, what do you do with material you find that had been produced over the previous, decade plus of dangerous materials? I mean, we had just fought a war against this horrific ideology, and there were manuscripts and documents that were propagating this hate and genocide and other things. So what do you do with that? Which leads to some fundamental issues that lead to some real conflict among the authorities. And then secondly, what do you do with material that you know or suspect has been stolen and taken from people, and how do you get it back either to the country of origin or to the actual original university or library source? So let's address each of those. First of all, the tension over Nazi materials. On the one hand, you want to preserve them as a record of what happened. On the other hand, there was definitely a movement to not allow this material to be floating about. But destroying it sure seems to get in the way of the core instincts of both the war effort and some of the people involved who have been involved in preserving documents.
Yeah. The issue of what to do with Nazi and militaristic materials, that in many ways was a big surprise to me. I was not expecting that. And what I learned was that even during the war, there were these various committees set up to plan for post-war planning. And because of a belief in how books work on people, that the social psychologists at this time and communications experts believed that essentially Nazi propaganda was like, being injected with, a virus.
Right.
And you had to get rid of it. You couldn't allow it in the schools. You couldn't allow it in the libraries. You couldn't allow it to resurface, or this would come back. Nazism would come back. And so right at the end of the war, there were these decisions made, and it was literally, again, as the troops were entering into German territory, you'd go to a town, you'd go to the schools, you'd pull all of that material off the shelves, sequester it, put it under lock and key, true of libraries, public libraries as well. And because the governing structure of policy was a four-part, was the four allied nations, the Soviet Union was very strong on just destroy this stuff. We know it when we see it, and right destroy it. And that's where they were coming from. The British and the Americans were kind of navigating the belief that, you need to get rid of it, but also we have these beliefs in freedom of speech, freedom of, free access to knowledge, freedom to read. We don't believe in censorship. We don't think censorship works. All of those impulses were at play as well. And so this became, as you say, a very thorny problem for the military government, the occupation government in Germany, and led to kind of increasing efforts to dig out this material. it kind of came to a head in November of 1946, May of 1946. And the Soviet Union wanted, really far-reaching policy. We're going to go into people's homes and take this material. And the British fought that off, but they expanded the policy of what was going to be taken. It would be from public libraries and everything else. And it was going to be destroyed. It's going to be brought together and destroyed. At that point, the American press gets wind of this. The American librarians get wind of this. And that creates a kind of uproar at home over, we fought the war to stop Nazi book burning, and now we're doing Nazi, now we're burning their books. Mm-hmm. So that was the problem.
That's an amazing intersection between the grand strategic issues, ending the Second World War and leading to the Cold War, and the very practical on the ground issues. Yeah. I mean, I think most people understand the idea of the Soviet Union moving quickly into Eastern Europe and the travesties that happened afterwards. And seeing the lines on the map that were formed afterwards gives you some of the picture, but it doesn't tell you that there were people on the ground trying to get into these cities to get materials before the other guys could get there and destroy them. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I find that this story about the documents, the books, the efforts that were taken, they actually illuminate and enrich that strategic picture. Just as I think you can't fully understand why some of these individuals in the T-forces and otherwise were so motivated to get into Leipzig, for example, and get something. The other side of this, before we move on to the returning of materials part, is the storage, because in some cases there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of mostly books, but other materials, and they had to find a way to hold them, to organize them, to even understand what they were before deciding the next level of question, which is what do we do with them? Talk a little bit about that effort and how it was that in these years, 1945, 1946 in particular, how it was that in certain locations they were finding ways to collect and organize these materials.
So these are the Nazi books.
Everything they were grabbing.
So there are several dimensions to this. There were document centers that were set up in Germany, big, sort of part of the military installations, and just, they were vast, and they were trying to get them organized, try to figure out what to send back to the United States because it might have intelligence value. They enlisted the help of what was the post-war iteration, the Library of Congress mission, to help them sort some of this out. And much of that material was then microfilmed. And the National Archives in College Park, in one of the microfilm rooms, has this vast number of boxes with the German captured records on microfilm. I mean, they're all there. So that was how they handled it, was to microfilm it all. And then like the school books and the books from the public libraries, that was truly vexing, because the American military government didn't want to simply destroy it because of the lesson. I mean, they felt like they were replicating, the Nazi regime. And so to try to kind of thread the needle here, their goal was to make Germany democratic, to instill democratic values. And how do you do that? You practice engaging in these values. And so they brought on Germans who they believed, who were sort of cleared of Nazi collaboration, to go through these boxes of materials and decide, is this Nazi, is this militaristic? Should this be destroyed? Should this be kept? And so that was the process that they went through.
You found the story, maybe it was in Offenbach, but it was somewhere that there was a massive building that was set up to bring a bunch of materials to. And there was so much material that they actually had to get a structural engineer to make sure that the building could support the weight of all the material being brought into it. That's amazing.
Billions of volumes.
Well, let's turn to that other side of this, which is, well, what do you do once you know or suspect that these books were taken from, let's say, a synagogue in Poland, what was now again going to be Poland, or somewhere else? What do you do with these materials? Because obviously that's a very practical question. You need to do something with it. But you might have now multiple entities interested. You might have the new country or liberated country expressing some interest. You might have private individuals. You might have the what eventually emerges as the state of Israel expressing interest in some of the things taken from Jewish populations in Europe. So talk through that dynamic and just how messy it was.
Yeah, so the Jewish looted books, I think that in many ways that was completely unexpected, not completely, but fairly unexpected, the quantity of them. The expectation was that the Germans would have destroyed those books as part of their, genocidal project. But instead, they had preserved these books with the idea of creating a library of a destroyed race. And so they kept many of these materials in Frankfurt. There was another operation in Berlin, but the one the Americans were most involved with was in Frankfurt. And the books were found, millions of books, brought to this warehouse. Initially, they were brought to a local library, the Rothschild Library. That became completely unwieldy in the first months after the war. And the Monuments Men group, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives group, which was part of the military, they were overwhelmed with what they saw as the valuable material, the artwork. And so it was a bit haphazard at the outset. But by early 1946, a couple of soldiers, officers, were put in charge of the Offenbach Archival Depot, as it was called, although it was a book depository, and set about the task of organizing and dealing with the material. And as you say, there were many contenders for what would happen to this, because many of the owners, if not most of the owners, were unidentifiable or were dead. And so, in the case of some of the looting in Western Europe, where material had been taken from the Spinoza house or from the Bibliothèque Nationale, you knew what those were, and those could be returned. But much of the material had been defaced or was, in individual archives, individual collections, private owners, and it was impossible to know how to return those to their owners. And the restitution policy at this time was that you restitute to the nation, you restitute to the state. And so there wasn't even a consideration of, okay, we want to get this back to this synagogue. So what happens is that these various organizations are contending for authority over how these materials should be dealt with. And these are largely Jewish organizations. There's a large one in the United States that's known as Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. There was one in England. There were groups Jewish groups in Palestine, especially around the Hebrew University, who wanted to bring those records there. And a lot of, you can imagine, a lot of diplomatic back and forth over how these should be dealt with.
Do I remember right that the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, that is the U.S. legal entity that was set up to do this, that they finally, as they apportioned things out, they apportioned more to Israel than to the United States, but that it was a split. That is, there were materials going all over the place to various universities, synagogues, etc.
Right. So when Jewish Cultural Reconstruction was making its decisions, it did agree that what would become the state of Israel, or what by then was the state of Israel, was the logical place for many of the materials, especially if they were unique, or if the Hebrew University did not have those volumes. And so A larger percentage was sent there, I think about 45%. About 40% came to the United States to go to various Jewish seminaries, other kinds of Jewish institutions, and about 10% went to other places around the world where there were Jewish communities, including South Africa, including places in Latin America, and a very small number to Germany, interestingly enough, where there was still a pretty significant remnant of German Jews.
Yeah. So let me take this up one level, kind of to tie a lot of this together. The legacy of these massive efforts. One of them we've alluded to already, which is just the preservation of these documents, the preservation of the books, the fact that there are probably millions of pieces of printed material in various places around the world that would not exist today if not for these efforts. So there's just that immediate visceral legacy. But there's also that legacy of the works of the OSS through these librarians and others actually did advance library and information science. That we'll put it this way, it kind of pushed forward changes that were already happening, but gave some real momentum to them in a way that ended up influencing the United States ever since, given our university library system, our incredible information systems that we have, the Library of Congress itself. So when you take a step back, asking you as a historian to get away from the details and the diaries and the letters, but take the big picture view looking at this, what do you think is the legacy of that interaction between these experts and the national security effort they supported?
I do think that the impact of the war on moving forward very dramatically information, science, and management was profound. That it gave a number of librarians who largely thought of themselves as book object people. The book is an object. It's a physical object. It gave them insight into how you disaggregate that object and turn it into bytes of information, bite-sized information. And they began to also think about how non-textual material could be identified and accessed. So photographs, for example, how do you organize photographs so that they can be easily accessed? So they were devising, I think, some of the rudimentary ideas about information science that then could be implemented with computerization. They were beginning to do a little bit of that in the Central Information Division portion of the which was a kind of large card cataloging operation of the OSS. They were beginning to explore that, and some of the people involved in the OSS information effort become leading information science and technology people after the war. Frederick Kilgore, Jesse Shera are among the really important people who do this, who figure out how you can computerize what 200 women clerks were doing in order to make this material accessible and bite-sized for wartime agencies. So that was, I think, really important. I think the war also gave them the confidence that they could do this. I mean, that having that experience, again, moved librarians out of a kind of specific world that they live in, which can sometimes seem quite rarefied, especially research librarians who work in universities, move that into, policy making, into being of a public service, and of serving what is this growing national security state. And the other thing I would say is that internationalization, which had always been an important part of what librarians do, I think that contributed to this sense of the global reach of American libraries and the importance of the American library system for the global impact of the United States.
And that's true even now. I was surprised to learn that the Library of Congress, even in recent decades, is acquiring more foreign language material than English material. Makes sense, right? To be the repository, to have so much available. there are so many other stories here that are interesting. I think the relationship between the federal government and private entities, like the efforts Herbert Hoover was involved in, the university libraries and their own interest, and when do they collaborate and work together, and when do they decide not to? Those are all fun sociological studies as well as historical ones. But we're going to leave it there on the main substance. But I do want to remind people, a lot of the stuff we talked about is in a book you published several years ago now, but a book called Information Hunters: When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe. It's a fascinating read, and especially for anyone who is familiar with the Monuments Men stories, what a great pairing to the book of Edsel Witter, I believe, was his co-author for that one. But we can't let you go yet, Kathy, because we have the Chatterbox. Let me see what it has for you. What book or books are you reading right now, or do you have on your stack of books coming up?
So having just been on vacation, I read a lot of fiction, including Tana French, who is a great detective fiction novelist with her work set in Ireland. And I read the amazing Percival Everett, whose book, for those of you interested in intelligence, he writes a hilarious book called Dr. No, which is a takeoff of the spy genre. And in my serious reading, I have Mark Stout's book on intelligence in World War I, which I'm very interested to read, and some other books on spycraft and intelligence for thinking about, to continue to think about the role of spies in World War II Lisbon.
That is great. And what a good range, right? From the fiction to the hardcore intelligence history. Kathy Peiss, thank you for spending so much time chatting with me about this. Thanks again for putting your personal research into professional form in the book Information Hunters. We appreciate it. That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.